In 2019, the New York Times launched a new project designed to trace the history of slavery and anti-Black racism from one day in August 1619, when a cargo ship carrying 20 or 30 enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. The purpose of the 1619 Project, as it's called, was to offer a closer and more accurate look at the role slavery has played in the United States' origin story and ongoing narrative. While many view the project as groundbreaking and necessary, it has its critics. Some reject the entire premise of the project. Other criticisms, however, are rooted in scholarly disagreements over things like, for instance, whether the institution of chattel slavery was an essential driver of the Revolutionary War.
And there were some who, while agreeing that slavery played a major role in the United States' founding and history, argued that the 1619 Project didn't go back far enough to get at the roots of the issue. Some, such as Robert P. Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute, argued that we need to look back to colonialism and the Age of Discovery. So not 1619, but 1493, the year after Columbus discovered a new world.
But what if understanding racism in the United States requires going back even further? Not to 1619, not to 1493, but back to the 4th century, when theologian, philosopher, and doctor of the Church Augustine of Hippo developed his formative theses about politics, society, and the relation of humanity to God.
What does St. Augustine have to do with slavery in the United States? That's what we're discussing on this episode of Glad You Asked. So, Augustine. He's such a complicated figure, and we can kind of connect him to so many things. Like from a literary perspective, he has this amazing, brilliant writing style that even translates well from Latin to English. We have these memorable lines like, "Late have I loved thee, beauty ever ancient, ever new." So, just from the perspective of the kind of classical education, Western civilization, his influence is enormous.
And obviously, his influence is even more enormous when it comes to theology and religion. His ideas on grace, original sin, and free will didn't just shape Christian theology, they became central to famous disputes in the Christian tradition, especially during the Reformation. And his ideas about the relationship between the church and the state are also hugely significant. But it wouldn't seem that they would be quite as significant when it comes to the founding of the United States, especially given that the founders advocated heavily for the separation of church and state, which is definitely something that Augustine did not advocate for.
But his ideas on slavery really appear to have lived on in Western political thought, even when thought leaders had maybe rejected Catholicism or moved on to a more liberal, rights based understanding of the political order.
Today's guest is going to talk to us about Augustine's beliefs on slavery and how they influenced Western history, including the institution of chattel slavery in the United States. I'm Emily Santa, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. Did St. Augustine defend slavery?
Today we're talking to Toni Alimi, assistant professor in the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University.
His research and teaching span ancient Roman philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary ethics and politics, and philosophy of religion. His first book, Slaves of God, explores Augustine's arguments for slavery and argues that slavery is a central theme in his broader ethics and politics.
For more information about his scholarship, take a look at the show notes for this episode.
Toni, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So you're at Cornell, right?
That's right.
I live outside of Rochester, so we're
Okay,
we're pretty close to each other. Yeah.
As close as things can be in central New York.
Right. So to start off, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your research into Augustine and how that kind of led to your book.
Sure. So, like many people, my first book is a product of my dissertation. I started um, PhD planning to work on topics in Augustine's sort of ethical theory, his meta-ethics. But partway through grad school, became fascinated with the fact that slavery as a concept shows up everywhere. I wanted to understand more what was going on. And after some time in the archives, learned that the secondary literature at the time was rather thin. And so the advice I was given was, well, hey, maybe you can fill some lacuna. And so there were three questions that I was really interested in understanding better. The first was just what in the world is Augustine's account of slavery? It's pretty clear in City of God, Book 19, that he thinks that it's in some sense permissible, justifiable, but like why? What are his reasons? So that was the first question that I was curious about. The second was that you see he moves in between his descriptions of slavery to God and chattel slavery. And I wanted to know more about what the relationship is between those two concepts, those two descriptions of slavery. So that's sort of the second major question, the relationship between slavery to God and intrahuman slavery. And then the third major question I was interested in was, okay, so suppose you have the answers to the first two. What implications does that have for the rest of his thought? And of course, in sort of working through the idea of slavery in Augustine's thought, you find that it really is everywhere. So there's no sort of way to do it comprehensively. But in particular, I was interested in some of the topics in his his moral and political thought that have been sort of central to Augustine's revival in kind of 20th and 21st century political theology, religious ethics. So I focused on the questions in my book of law, authority, and citizenship. So that was sort of the third question. So what's the relationship between Augustine's account of slavery and his accounts of law, authority, rule, and citizenship?
So, just to kind of offer some historical context for listeners who are less familiar with the topic, what did slavery look like in Augustine's day?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and unfortunately, one that's not straightforward to answer. So, what I'll do is I'll sort of start with the caveat that the details of what slavery looks like is just going to be different in different parts of ancient and late antique Rome. But here's some things we can say in general. So, in general, slavery was a crucial aspect of the Roman economy and social life for much of Rome's history. It's difficult to determine the precise size of the slave population. Scholarly estimates maybe range from like 10% to 10 to 15% on the low end, like 15 to 25% on the high end. These are, I should say, estimates from different points in Roman history. The 10 to 15% is maybe an estimate from a little bit closer to Augustine's time, closer to late antiquity. So the sort of pretty big range should maybe give you some confidence about the order of magnitude rather than the precise number of slaves. But in any case, what we're talking about is like millions of slaves in the empire in Augustine's day. And Augustine is intimately familiar with the institution. His father owned slaves. Augustine had slaves in his household when he was growing up. Augustine's mother, Monica, grew up in a household with slaves, so this is not an institution that's foreign to him. Slaves were property, and they were a source of labor. So many large, wealthy landowners depended on slaves or tenant farmers for agricultural labor, but even more commonly, they were found in the domestic context. So think of slaves as running the house, taking care of children, waiting on their masters and mistresses. That doesn't mean that slavery was primarily what we would call today unskilled labor. By unskilled labor today, I think people often mean jobs for which like no formal education is required, and that's just not true of ancient Roman slavery. So you have slaves who are doctors, accountants, architects, business managers, things like that. that may make it sound like the institution wasn't that bad or something. That's just that would be a mistake as well. So if we think about the legal status of a slave lacked fundamentally the rights of citizenship. Slaves could not vote, they could not bring complaints against their masters in court, and moreover, their testimony was considered inherently untrustworthy. And so they actually lacked probably the most important instrument of social power to contend with their own abuse. And for this reason, they were often beaten, whipped, and sexually abused. Slaves died far younger than the average unenslaved Roman. Of course, since a slave was property, if he or she was harmed, the master could bring a case against the party that harmed the slave. But in this case, the victim is not the slave. The victim is the master. It's the equivalent of, you scratch my car and I take you to court or something. Well, I'm the victim, not my car. My car is not a bearer of rights or wrongs. And so redress for the wrong would go to the master, not the slave. So in the book, what I do is emphasize that Roman jurists and philosophers understood slaves to be human. They really were human. It's actually important for the account of Roman slavery that they're human, but still they're dominated and they're property. So because they're human, you can entrust slaves to develop skills and perform functions that are property humans, like taking care of your children or managing your business. As property, slaves could be bought and sold and lacked legal rights. And as dominated, they lacked recourse legally to shield themselves from abuse, and the abuse was ubiquitous.
So I know this is a really big question, but in broad strokes, what sorts of things does Augustine say about slavery?
Yeah, so maybe one way you can think about it is sort of three kinds of slavery. So one kind is slavery to God, a second kind is slavery to sin, and then a third kind is slavery to humans. Augustine thinks that all humans, as a matter of being created, are slaves of God. So here's what happened when Adam sinned. Augustine says that Adam fled from slavery to God and became a slave of sin. And each of us flee in Adam's fleeing. So the Latin word for he flees, Adam flees, he flees, is fugit. And that's where we get our English word fugitive. So that's how Augustine thinks of humans. All of us are slaves on the run from God, our original master. And in virtue of our fugitivity, God is entitled to discipline, punish, and coerce us, to bring us back into divine service. So here's why God should do that from Augustine's perspective. When we flee, we take on sin as a master. That's what Adam did. That's what all of us are doing in our sin. And sin is a maximally cruel master. It's maximally cruel because its punishments are eternal. So Augustine says, imagine what it's like to be a slave of another human. Well, once you die, your slavery is over. So, worst case scenario, you're a slave for 80, 90 years. Right? Whereas with sin, its punishments are eternal. So you're a slave of sin in this life, and then if you remain a slave of sin, you die, and then you're a slave of sin for eternity. So sin is sort of, it's a much worse master than any kind of human. The other way in which slavery to sin is worse than slavery to other humans is that sin has this way of reshaping your desires to kind of make you, to sort of bring you into its grip in more profound ways. So think of someone, for example, who's in the grip of the sin of avarice. So they think to themselves, okay, well, if I can just make, I don't know, if I can make $100,000 a year salary, I'm going to be happy. And, they work really hard and they do. And maybe, so they start achieving that. But by the time they get there, their desires have changed such that they need more. And so Augustine is really sensitive to this and worried about it. He thinks that's one of the sort of insidious things that sin does. It's not just coercing you the way a normal human master would. It's coercing you by changing your desires such that in a way you actually become addicted to your master. And so he thinks this is a second important way in which slavery is especially cruel. And so Augustine's thinking, look, if God is our master, God is a good master, and when we flee, we take on sin as a master, and sin is maximally cruel, then of course God should do whatever is in God's power to bring us back. And one of the instruments that God uses to bring us back is chattel slavery. So that's the That's the account. So Augustine says to human masters, he's speaking to patris familias, the Roman heads of household, and he says, look, you head of a household, you have under your authority, you have children, you're really your sons specifically, and that's going to be important for what comes next, and you have your slaves. And he says, think of your relationship to your slaves as roughly analogous to the relationship you have to your sons in the following respect. Because you're the head of the household, it's your job to distribute the household goods in a way that benefits everyone. And the most important good that you owe your children is the eternal good of friendship with God or service to God, and also things like developing virtue. Now, you also owe your son certain temporal goods. So you owe your son, for example, emancipation when your son reaches the age of legal majority. If you're in the position to do so, you also owe your son a financial inheritance. So Augustine says to the master, think of your slave as just the same, except you don't owe them the temporal goods. You just owe them the eternal ones. So your responsibility to your slave is to help your slave become a Christian and to help develop your slave in virtue. So there's nothing inherently bad or wrong with chattel slavery. Right? It's a result of sin, and in some sense reflects the world's imperfection. If there hadn't been a fall, there wouldn't be chattel slavery, and it could be abused. But that doesn't make it inherently bad or wrong. In fact, it can be really useful. So the analogy I like to use in case it's helpful is of medicine. So if you think about the perfect world, in the perfect world, there is no medicine, right? There's no medicine because there's no illness. So there's no need for it. And of course, medicine can be abused. Doctors can misprescribe or overprescribe. Patients can fail to take their medicines or fail to take them properly. But no one would infer from all of the abuses of medicine that medicine itself is inherently bad or wrong, right? And that's how Augustine is thinking about chattel slavery.
So, based on these ideas, how do these kind of overflow into Augustine's views on, say, the relationship between God and humanity, or about his kind of socio-political views on how we relate to one another?
Yeah, so let me say something about each. So Augustine has this, Augustine speaks of humans as slaves of God everywhere, and it's clear, if you start looking for it, that his understanding of what it is to be a slave of God is deeply informed by his understanding of the relationship of chattel slavery between humans. So here are two moments where this is salient. But as I said, it's everywhere. In a sermon, I believe Sermon 21, Augustine is talking about the obligation that humans have to be faithful to God. And here's how he narrates the obligation. So he says, and he knows that some of his parishioners are masters. They own slaves. So that's why he gives the following description. He says, look, you master, here's one thing you demand from your slaves. You demand that they're faithful to you. Now, in virtue of what are you entitled to make this demand of your slave? And he answers for the master, it's because you bought the slave. That's why you have rights a right to the slave's fidelity. And then the kicker, how much more does God have a right to your fidelity? Because he didn't just buy you, he made you, he created you. So that's the sort of the core thing. So what Augustine is doing is he's filling out the details of the image that he gets from Scripture, that humans are slaves of God. He's changing the image a bit because in Scripture, as far as I know, there is no attestation to universal slavery to God. Augustine universalizes it. But he's filling out the image that everyone is a slave of God with the sort of details from the social institution that he's looking around and seeing. So this is one moment. Here's another. In a commentary on Psalm 122, Augustine is trying to figure out what the psalmist is doing when the psalmist says, cry out to the hands that beat you, have mercy on us, O Master, have mercy, O Lord. In Augustine's Latin Bible, the word for Lord, Dominus, is translatable just as well as Master or Lord. And indeed, in this context, Master is probably a better translation because Augustine is speaking of the person crying out as a slave. So here's what Augustine says. He says, look, you slaves of God, your whole life is your beating. And indeed, all of humanity has been beaten since Adam fled from God and since he was cast out from God's presence as a spider, or like a spider. And so he says, once you recognize that your entire life is one where God is whipping you, how could you do anything except cry out to the hands of your master, have mercy on us? So he's taking the social image of a whip, that most sort of salient symbol of the master's rule over the slave, and he's claiming that it characterizes the divine-human relationship. So for Augustine, he's learning, or he's building an account of how God and humans relate to one another, using the data he sees from everyday cases of chattel slavery. And this is, by the way, just as an aside, how he fills in all of his descriptors of the divine-human relationship. So for Augustine, it's like, how do you know what it is for God to be father of humans? Well, look at ordinary human parenting. How do you know what Scripture is on about when it sort of uses this image of like the church as the bride of Christ? Well, look at ordinary marital relationships. And so in just the same way, how do you know what it's like to be a slave of God? Well, look at like ordinary relationships of slavery. So this is one case these are two cases of how Augustine is sort of filling out the divine-human relationship, using the sort of the account or the understanding of slavery he's getting from his day. Now, you also asked about some of his broader thoughts, but should I pause there for a second, or should I just keep going?
I'm kind of interested in how this possibly inflects his perspective on human relationships. 'Cause it's sounding a little disturbing.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think yes, it is disturbing. It's Augustine's best effort to wrestle with the scriptural data, to be sure, and I think it's reasonable to be disturbed by it because the account it's a disturbing one and in many ways an offensive one. So I'll say something about interhuman relationships. I'll give you one kind of good case and one maybe bad case. So one of the things that Augustine is most famous for in the modern context, and from my own personal perspective, one of the most inspiring aspects of his political thought is his analysis of imperialism and its errors. So here's the structure of the criticism in City of God, Book 15, as I understand it. Augustine says that every political community, he's getting this from sort of Roman political thought, from Cicero, political communities are organized around shared goods. So think about the goods that the political communities that you're a part of share. We share things like land and material resources, water, air, maybe also like money. And then maybe we also share sort of non-material things like the laws. And Augustine says there are two kinds of goods. Some of them are competitive and some of them are non-competitive. A competitive good has the structure such that if you increase the number of people who are sharing in the good, each person's share decreases. So this is how land works, and it's how money works too, at least if you understand money as share of a currency. And Augustine thinks that the problem with ordinary political communities is that because they're organized around competitive goods, the inevitable fact of human population increase means that either you're going to have a civil war because no one wants to relinquish the goods that they have, and yet they must as the population increases, or you're going to have imperialism. So Rome's population increases. The only solution, if everyone isn't going to give up some of the goods they have, is for Rome to start expanding and taking over goods from its neighbors. And Augustine thinks that this is the essential problem that characterizes all political communities and has made imperialism such a core feature of all of human history. So far as I go with Augustine personally, I think, that seems like a really nice insight. So here's Augustine's solution. He says, what you need is a political community organized around shared goods that are non-competitive. And he thinks the only way to achieve that is if everyone submits to a non-competitive good. So what does that mean? It means being a faithful slave of God. And if you don't do that, Augustine thinks, then you actually can't have a republic in the proper sense of the term, because the problem of competition over shared goods will always recur. So this is a case where I think, in my view, Augustine is sort of on the money for his account of what's gone wrong. And you can kind of see why his account forces him to take this solution to a genuine problem. And yet, if you're worried about the idea of humans as slaves of God, understood as Augustine did, understanding it as Augustine did, as implying that God is in a position to unaccountably, violently punish us, then you might think that Augustine has just gotten the wrong solution to a real problem. So this is, I think, a moment where the sort of the good and the bad, potentially the bad, depending on your view of slavery to God, I guess, the good and the bad kind of come together in his account in a really profound way.
So I imagine that some people might be making the argument of, well, he was a product of his time. Slavery was so universal in his culture. Like, what else is he supposed to do theology based out of, right? Is that an accurate argument? Was there anyone opposing these ideas or who, said no, slavery is bad, right? Like, what else was going on in church writing at that time that maybe was not in line with Augustine's ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think your hunch that the sort of product of his time explanation isn't going to be a terribly satisfying one is right for two reasons. One, which you've put your finger on, and then a second one. So the first is that though there are not many critics of slavery that Augustine is familiar with, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, there are some, and at least one, and Augustine was familiar with him. So Lactantius was a 3rd and 4th century North African Christian convert, or convert to Christianity, who sort of had a career in a way sort of similar to Augustine's. And a teacher of rhetoric, ended up in the imperial courts. But he lives and writes about 100 years before Augustine, and Lactantius's text, The Divine Institutes, was probably kind of the most sophisticated and certainly respected among the Christian intelligentsia anti-pagan Roman polemic until Augustine wrote The City of God. And Augustine is pretty clearly familiar, actually deeply familiar with Lactantius's Divine Institute. So there's been some nice work in the last 3 decades showing sort of key moments in texts like Augustine's On True Religion and City of God, where he's sort of demonstrating that he's pretty clearly reading and learning from Lactantius, especially books 1 and 4, and I think maybe also 7 of the Divine Institutes. Okay, so why does that matter? It matters because Lactantius actually has a pretty interesting criticism of slavery. Not that Lactantius is an abolitionist, but he thinks that slavery fundamentally expresses disrespect for the equality that all humans enjoy with one another. And Lactantius grounds this equality in our slavery to God. So Lactantius is one of the first to argue that all humans are slaves of God, as far as I understand it, the history. But Lactantius infers from this that interhuman slavery is wrong because it usurps a position that only God is entitled to. And because all of us are slaves of God, we are on an equal plane. And so any moral or political organization that denies that is in some sense denying the fact about humanity. Augustine almost certainly knows that this argument is out there and just doesn't seem to be that worried about it. So we can't say that he's merely a product of his time. That's the first half. The other half of the problem with saying he's merely a product of his time is I think it actually fails to respect Augustine's willingness to break with convention in other respects, right? So, for example, I mentioned his criticism of imperialism. Of course, imperialism is a product of, or a fact of Augustine's moment, and yet we don't find Augustine going, well, everyone's into imperialism, so here's my defense of it. Even sort of maybe, to modern readers, even more peculiarly, is his criticism of the theater, where Augustine sort of he's really upset about the practice of the Roman theater. He's not uncritical about it at all, and yet this is also sort of a feature of Augustine's time. So if we just say, well, Augustine is accommodating slavery because he's a product of his time, we then lose the ability to understand how he could criticize those features of Roman culture and society that were ubiquitous. And so I think we are actually forced to look for an explanation of Augustine's account of slavery. We can't sort of explain it away by saying, well, he was a man of his time or something like that.
So, what's the legacy of these ideas from Augustine? Did people use his views on slavery to defend slavery in the more modern era? Were his views on slavery kind of passed on through an Augustinian tradition?
To both of your questions, yes, they were. So here's one sort of strange feature of Augustine's account that maybe you and some of your listeners will have picked up on. You might worry that if the purpose of slavery, or if one of the main purposes of slavery is for masters to help their slaves become Christian, why are there any non-Christian masters, and why are there any Christian slaves, right? And Augustine doesn't solve this problem, unfortunately. He doesn't. It would be nice if he kind of gave a nice answer, but he doesn't. So you get this sort of this gap in Augustine's account, and one of the things I argue in my book is that in the early modern period, and specifically in British colonies, the development of race as a salient legal category is actually an attempt to bridge the gap that Augustine leaves unbridged. So here's the problem. So in colonies like Barbados and Maryland and Virginia, up until, I think, the mid-17th century, the explicit legal justification for slavery, so this is in the legislative record, is that African slaves are non-Christian. This is roughly an Augustinian account. Then you have Quaker missionaries preaching the gospel to slaves, and some slaves asking to be baptized. And the problem that arises is if slavery is a solution to the problem of being non-Christian, then once someone converts, you may have to manumit them. And that's obviously not what the institution is supposed to do. And so what we see in the latter part of the 17th century and into the 18th century is a shift in the laws from justifying slavery on grounds that the imported enslaved people were not Christian, to grounds that the imported enslaved people were Black. And so, in a way, it seems like the legal salience of race emerges, at least in these colonies, as an attempt to solve a problem that Augustine's inheritors inherited from Augustine because he didn't himself resolve. So this is a way in which the inheritance is meaningful. My colleague Matt Aliyah, who's written a book called The Legacy of the Christian Master, has also found actually just some 19th century pro-slavers who are explicitly invoking Augustine to justify slavery on the eve of and during the Civil War. So Samuel Seabury, who was a professor of theology at General Theological Seminary, invokes Augustine's account as a sort of justification of slavery in 1861, and John Henry Hopkins does something similar in 1864. One of the things that I think is worth wrestling with, and I hope there's more research on this, is So there's a historian of American religion named Peter Thurston who's written this nice article that argues that America's sort of most prominent anti-slavery family, the Beechers, they thought that Augustinian theology was one of the most significant obstacles to the abolitionist movement. And one of the things I'm hoping to do some work on, and hope others work on this too, is figure out why the Beechers thought this. So what was it, aside from Augustine sort of on its the sort of pro-slavery on its face? What was it about Augustinian theology that was sort of so meaningful and so sticky in this moment that the anti-slavers were like, we haven't been able to make as much progress as we would have liked because of Augustine. And I think the title of his paper is something really nice. It's something like it's the African colonization of the American mind. So it's sort of a play on Euro-American colonialism, because it's the African Augustine who's colonizing the minds of the Americans, and as a result making abolitionism more difficult than it otherwise might have been.
What about today, down to the modern era? Are there still parts of Augustine's ideas that have kind of sprinkled into Augustinian thought today, and kind of what's the legacy of all of that?
Yeah, great question. So the best book on this, I think, is the one I mentioned by Matt Elia, The Legacy of the Christian Master. In my book, I talk about some things, but he argues that in a way, contemporary Augustinian political thought reflects a kind of positionality with the master, where Augustine is usually thinking, but he's thinking about topics like humility and pilgrimage and even time itself from the master's perspective. And Elia argues that this is sort of this is reflected in contemporary Augustinian thought. In the book, I argue that Augustine's account of law turns out to be sort of intimately linked to his account of slavery, and it's a bit complicated, so I won't go into the details here, but the sort of general idea is that in both accounts, Augustine goes in for coercion. So Augustine endorses religious coercion, for example, of the Donatists, for the reason that if you don't coerce, the consequence is eternal slavery. And so there's a kind of isomorphism in his account of slavery and his account of law. And the account of slavery has, I think, at least it's been something that a lot of contemporary Augustinian political theology has attempted to wrestle with. But even if we try to step back from Augustinians who are talking about political theology in particular, I do think one of the reasons that we can't just leave Augustine behind is what I suggested earlier, that race achieves legal salience in 17th and 18th century English colonial law because of a problem Augustine leaves unresolved, right? So insofar as we are all inheritors of early modern and maybe even earlier descriptions of race and living under the political regime that the emergence of race created, Augustine is with us. And so I guess we can you could try and say, well, let's just leave him behind. But if you are interested at all in understanding our own position, then I suppose we have to wrestle with those who have shaped the position. And so that's, at least for me, why I'm not sure we can just leave Augustine behind. There's a quote that I like from the movie Magnolia. It says, the book says we may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. That's sort of how I feel about Augustine. Like, you can decide that you don't want to deal with him, and that's your prerogative. And indeed, for many people, I endorse it. But Augustine isn't through with us, and so we can't get rid of him.
Now, we always like to close by asking our guests, what's the one thing you would like our listeners to take away from this conversation?
So I've been pretty critical of Augustine in this in these 30 minutes or so, and perhaps warrantedly. But here's something I hinted at earlier that I really do think is important. So Augustine, first of all, far more clever than I am, and more importantly, far more pious than I am. And Augustine's account reflects, I think, for all of his various infelicities, reflects his best effort to deal with the scriptural evidence, testimony regarding the topic of slavery, both intrahuman slavery and slavery to God. Augustine takes himself to be doing, first and foremost, I think, faithful scriptural exegesis. And so the easy thing to do is to say, well, he's gotten the scriptures wrong in some key moments. And I think that's right. The much harder thing to do is to figure out what the right interpretation of the text that he's wrestling with is, or the right interpretations are. And so I think that one way in which Augustine can be really useful for us is he is pressing on some key interpretive points. And to the degree that we think he's wrong, he's forcing us to figure out what to say about the text in those key moments where we think he's gone astray. And so even as a kind of foil for us, I think Augustine's account of slavery can be incredibly useful.
That's all our questions for today. Thanks so much again for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Wow, that was like taking a whole seminar. I feel like I learned so much just in that discussion. Now, here to help us unpack a little bit is our senior editor, Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, guys.
Yeah, so was there anything that surprised either of you about that interview?
I'm pretty caught up in the idea that while Augustine's, thinking is so complex and he's so willing to critique a lot of cultural norms in society at his time, like imperialism and like what was it like theater, um, but like doesn't really go and push back against slavery, and just kind of accepts the system. So I find that to be kind of like a glaring gap and like kind of struggle with the idea that there's not really a good explanation for that in his theology.
I think that was really interesting because, like, we talk about slavery as America's original sin, but I've seen the same kind of weird inability to critique racism when looking at the kind of Christian classical literature of the 20th century. Like, Flannery O'Connor, for instance, she's celebrated as being countercultural and, she's showing the whole culture where they're going wrong and boldly standing against a secular society that's rejected goodness. But then she gets really timid when it comes to confronting slavery in the South. So it's almost like this willingness to defend slavery is kind of like Christianity's original sin almost.
Yeah, it's frustrating to know that he was aware also of other Christian thinkers, other like church fathers work around like slavery, like but like he just didn't engage with it.
I guess I'm also a little, maybe frustrated is not the right word, but I've taken classes in Augustine at the undergraduate, the graduate level at these like progressive seminaries, and not once did anyone kind of point out what he thought about slavery and kind of the impact that has had. And it seems like such a major part of his writing, of his thought, of kind of, an undercurrent in how he teased out a lot of his theology. And why isn't this something we were talking about before? I don't know if that was something that surprised me or something that enraged me a little bit, that this is the first time that anyone has really stopped to do this sort of critique of his theology.
Yeah, it kind of so like to your point, Emily. I studied Augustine in very conservative settings, so of course we weren't picking away at that or at his views on women or anything like that. So I just assumed that those conversations were happening in other circles. It's kind of shocking to me to learn that they're not.
Yeah, so was there anything that you wish we could have gotten into in more depth or asked for more information about?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the extent to which Augustine's perceptions, this kind of hierarchical view of the relationship between human beings and different classes of human beings would have been reflected in his ideas and his relationship with God, because he writes like so beautifully about, God seeking him, God was pursuing him all along, and obviously, God is the creator, God is all powerful and all wise, but I also wonder whether some of this tendency to kind of emphasize the authoritarian side of God, a God who perhaps doesn't respect people's boundaries and coerces them, whether that's kind of a theological problem that trickles over into socio-political issues. That's something I would have loved to have asked him more about.
Yeah, I know he mentioned, I'm gonna butcher this name, licentious. um, when we asked him if there were other writers who were explicitly kind of going against the ideas of slavery at the time. But I'm curious if there are any other thinkers, how his contemporaries were addressing slavery or failing to address slavery. I think he mentioned Origin in his book as someone who had a really different perspective. So to that point about kind of just passing this off as like a product of Augustine's time, I wish we had had more time to kind of get into counter examples, because I think that's a really important thing to be able to demonstrate and to be able to say, because that is such a common reasoning when it comes to things like this.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone's written a book on that. Like, that would be an amazing book. I'm just thinking about like Plato kind of criticizes the institution of slavery a little bit in the Republic, and that's kind of contrasted to Aristotle, who's super traditional. Is like, oh yes, slaves are just naturally slaves, naturally inferior. And the Neoplatonic tradition was super influential for Augustine. So I just want to know, like, once again, we didn't talk about this in graduate school.
Yeah, Sarah, anything you would have wanted to follow up on?
So I guess I'm curious to learn more about how the justification of slavery changed when enslaved people became Christian, and then also like what that tells us about the ways religious beliefs can be manipulated to uphold oppressive systems.
I mean, that's a good segue into our last question, right? Which is, if you were giving a sermon on the topic of today's interview, what would be the call to action? And so, Sarah, I think you kind of already have the nut of that in what you just said, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'd want people to examine and also reflect on how the church, perhaps like Augustine, while being countercultural in some respects, also might not be going far enough in challenging systems that perpetuate injustice.
So I think I would want to remind people that in the gospel, Jesus made it very clear that the preferential option is always going to be for those who are marginalized, who are deprived of the powers associated with empire. And when the church starts tilting towards using the power of empire to reinforce pre-existing societal injustices and hierarchies, that's when our little warning bells should go off, and we should ask ourselves, is this really of Christ or is this of the world?
I keep thinking about how in today's social media environment, we have limited the church fathers to like cute quotes and sound bites. And this is problematic for a variety of reasons, but I think it prevents us from really understanding where they were coming from and their full worldview and how that worldview affected their theologies. And it keeps us from kind of critically engaging with that to the way that we should. I feel like a lot of my sermons come down to be mindful about social media. But that's gonna be another one that maybe that's not the best way to engage with someone like Augustine, who, yes, has a lot of really beautiful things to say, but also is the foundation for a lot of really harmful, sinful systems that continue today.
But follow us on social media.
Yes, spread the news about our show.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on Glad You Asked? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org.
This year, in recognition of our 90th anniversary, US Catholic is offering a special subscription deal. Subscribe or renew your print subscription for 1 year, and we'll give you a free gift subscription to share with a friend. Visit uscatholic.org/gift to learn more, because great conversations and great Catholic journalism are meant to be shared.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler-Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.